Hey look, you made it all the way to level 5, Rendering Extremities. In this level, we're going to be taking a look at controller rendering options, some custom RESTful routes, rendering custom JSON, which is really useful if you're creating an API, and then finally we'll be diving into a bunch of AJAX. First, some review. Here is our zombies controller. There's our show action, right? There's no response to in there. So by default, it's going to be looking for a file in the zombies directory called show.html.erb. It's going to be looking to render that. If that's the only thing that we're rendering, that's all we need. But what if we want to respond to both HTML and JSON? What do we need to change then? Well, that's where we do need that responds to block. So let's write that here. Responds to format HTML. So that's saying, yes, this can respond to HTML if it's requested. That little comment there, show.html.erb, that's not doing any configuration at all. That's just a reminder for us to let us know that that's what it's going to be looking for. And then maybe we also want to respond to JSON. So we say format JSON and then send in the zombie, and it's going to properly do the JSON version of that zombie object. What if, though, if the zombie is dead again, we want to render dead again, that dead again HTML file. What do we do then? Well, what we can do is we can create a block. So let's do format HTML do. We're going to check the decomposition to see if it's dead again. If it's dead again, render out the dead again view. And we don't need an else, because if it doesn't hit that conditional, it's simply by default going to render out the show.html.erb. Cool. What if we realize after we write this code that we don't need JSON at all? This is a web application. It's only ever going to respond to browsers. We don't need the JSON version of it. What do we do then? Well, at that point, we can get rid of that respond to block again, right? So we can get rid of the respond to block, just have this. Okay. Well, what if we only need JSON? On the other hand, what if we don't need HTML at all? Now we just need JSON. How might it change? Well, we don't need to add the response to block. We only need to add rendered JSON zombie. The moral of the story is that if our action only needs to respond to one thing, we don't need to have that response to block. But since we're talking about JSON, when we're returning JSON using an API, we also need to make sure we're returning the correct status codes. Some common status codes include OK, which is the default, created, unprocessable entity. There's also unauthorized, processing, and not found. You may see these in the scaffold that's created by default. In there you might see unprocessable entity used when we're returning the errors for the zombie. You also might see status created returned when we're creating a new zombie. This is also returning another header called location. It's just an API best practice that if you're creating a new resource, you return a location which has the URL of where to find that resource. Let's customize our API a little. Let's create a custom action in our zombies controller that's going to return the decomposition status, and if it's dead again, then also return the status code unprocessable entity. How might we do that? Well, it's going to take two steps. First, we need to add a new member route, a custom route, and then we're going to create a new action in the zombies controller. So let's jump into it. The custom route we want is going to look like this. So we can go to zombie/for/decomp and get back the JSON of the decomposition status. One way we can create this custom route is by using the match command, which we saw in the previous Rails for zombies. So something like this. We can do that, but there's a better way to do it. We can go into the resources you see here. Here's our nested resources, and we can specify get decomp on member. This is going to create a custom RESTful route. It does the same thing as that match line up there. Then we can run rake routes. It'll give us back the routes, the path, the method, the URL that gets generated, and the action that gets called, which might be good to reference. We can link to it using this route helper if we want, so we can just say decomp zombie path. Before we move on, let's take a deeper look at these two types of custom routes that we can use with our resources. There's a member route, which acts on a single resource, and there's the collection route, which acts on a collection of resources. Let's take a look at a couple examples. So here's our example. We're getting the decomposition state. We have to send in the resource that we want the decomposition state from, and then that gives us this route helper. Well, if we wanted to update the decay on a specific zombie. Update is to put, so we could say put decay on member. This is our URL, and there is our route helper. If we wanted to get a list of all the freshest zombies, we could create a collection route called getFreshOnCollection. It would create this URL, and here would be the route helper. If we wanted to create a search on the zombies, we could call postSearchOnCollection. So it's going to act on the collection of those resources. This is the URL, and here's the route helper. Some examples of using this in our views: we could have link to fresh zombies, fresh zombie path, and if we had a search form, it could look like this. Let's jump back to our challenge now. So we figured out how to add that member route. The next step is we need to create a new action inside Zombies controller. So here we are in our Zombies controller. We have a decomp action. It's going to fetch the current zombie, check to see if decomposition is equal to dead again. If it is, then we're going to render out the JSON with status unprocessable entity. Otherwise, just render out the JSON with status OK. This is going to render out JSON that looks like this. And we don't want it to render out everything. We only care about that decomp value right there. So we're going to have to modify this code a little bit. So let's take a deeper look at the toJSON syntax. If we only care about the name of the zombie in our JSON, we can run toJSON only name. If we want the name and the age, we can just send in an array. If instead of including things, we want to exclude things, we can say except created at, updated at, ID, email, bio. That would print this out. And we can also include relationships. Remember, a zombie has a brain. We can tell it to include that in the JSON that it creates. So in this case, it would include this. Check out that brain towards the bottom. I noticed here that it is also including zombie ID, which we also might want to hide. Might be a good idea, but let's just continue on. What if we want to make this last line the default JSON response when we call zombie to JSON? How might we do this? Well, we're going to dive into the zombie model. Inside there, we're going to define as JSON, set a parameter called option that defaults to nil. We'll call super options and then our hash. What this is doing is it's checking to see if we sent in specifically what we want back from the JSON, and if we have specifics about what we want, use that. Otherwise, if we just called toJSON, use this hash. So let's jump back into our challenge now with this new knowledge. Here's our decomposition action again. If zombie decomp is dead again, render out only decomp with status unprocessable entity. Otherwise, just render out decomp. By default, the status is going to be OK, so I don't need to mention it in this second render. Here's the JSON that it's going to print out. And now, we're about halfway through. We've gotten through rendering, custom render routes, custom JSON, and now we're on to the fun part, writing some AJAX. When I talk about AJAX, I'm talking about making actions in the browser so when we click a link or submit a form, the page doesn't refresh. Stuff happens, it contacts the server, doesn't refresh the browser. For example, the first challenge we're going to look through is when delete is pressed on this list, we want that item to fade out automatically, not refresh the browser. How do we do that? Well, a couple different steps. First, we need to make that delete link a remote call. Then we're going to allow the controller to accept that JavaScript request. Then we'll write the JavaScript to send back to the client. So let's jump into it. So here is the index view. We're going through each of the zombies, doing that div for you saw earlier. Link to zombie, we've got actions edit and delete. So in this case, it's delete we want to look at. All we have to do to make it a remote call is add remote true. That's all there is to it. If you take a look at what this generates in the client, you'll see that all it's doing is adding another one of those HTML5 elements, data remote. Rails, of course, is using that unobtrusive JavaScript file we saw earlier to hook into that and make it an AJAX call. So we've made the link remote call. That was our first step. We're done with that. Next up, we need to allow the controller to accept the JavaScript call, which is a lot easier than you might think. So let's jump into the zombies controller. Here is our destroy action. This is the default scaffolding destroy action, nothing fancy about it. All we have to do here is write format.js, and that tells our action that it can respond to JavaScript. That's all we have to do there. Next up, the third step, we need to write the JavaScript to send back to the client. So let's jump into that. That we would put in the destroy.js.erb. In there, we just call DOM ID on the zombie to get the div ID where that zombie lives, and call .fadeout so we can fade it out. Let's go ahead and take a look at what this view looks like. So here's a little screencast. We hit delete and it fades out. We can hit delete on Tony, it fades out, and let's do one more. Delete and it fades out. Pretty cool. So we can destroy zombies using Ajax. Let's add a form so that when we type in a zombie name here, we can hit that Create Zombie button, and it'll automatically populate that list without refreshing the page. A couple steps involved here. We need to write format.js in the controller. Simple as that. Refactor the view. We're going to refactor the view a little bit and then create the form. And then lastly, we're going to create the JavaScript. So let's dive into it. Here we are in our zombies controller. This is the default create action you get with your scaffolding. All we need to do here again is add format.js. Next step, we need to refactor the view and create the form. So here is our zombie list again. We're going to refactor this. We're going to create a partial. It'll make it easier for our Ajax. So we're going to take out the div, put the div into a zombie partial. Then inside of our loop, all we have to do is render zombie. This is a little bit different than our form partial we saw earlier. There's no quotes around zombie. What's happening under the covers is that Rails is looking at that zombie active record model, looking at the class, and then looking for a partial for that class, which by default is going to be the zombies file in the zombies directory. We can actually refactor this loop to do just render zombies. So those two things there, they're the same thing. Rails is smart enough to know that we have a group of zombies, we want to iterate over them and render out the zombies partial. Now let's write the Ajax form for creating the zombie. So here we have form for zombie new, remote, true. That's how we make it an Ajax form. Inside there we're going to have div class field and the submit button down there in the bottom. That's all there really is to it. Now let's create the JavaScript. So inside the create.js.erb, we're going to go inside that zombies div, and we're going to append a new zombie. We're going to call escape JavaScript render zombie. We have to escape it properly because we're putting all this HTML right into this JavaScript. Then we're going to specify the div for the zombie we just created and highlight it. So it's going to highlight in yellow. But what about when the name is blank? We do have a validation on name for our zombie. So we need to have some sort of feedback to let people know when they try to submit the form when it's blank that that's not working. So we're going to add to the JavaScript. We're going to check to see if the zombie is a new record. If it's a new record, that means it did not save successfully, in which case we want to highlight the form. We're going to highlight it in red. Otherwise, go ahead and append the new zombie to the list. Since we're using the highlight effect here, we're going to have to add jQuery UI to our JavaScript libraries. To do that, we're going to jump into the application.js, and all we have to do is require jQuery_UI. That's all there is to it. Now, here's a screencast of it in action. So we click Create Zombie, and it doesn't work. It gives us that red. We can then start adding zombies, and they get added right on to the list of the zombies and highlighted. Two more challenges left. In this one, we want to create a form which allows us to set a custom decomposition phase on the zombie show page. To do this, we need to create a custom route for our action, new custom route. We need to define the form, create the action in the controller, and then write the JavaScript which we're going to send back to the client. So first things first, let's jump back into our routes. Here we have our routes file. Inside there, we're going to update the decomposition status. So we're going to do a put action, call it custom decomp on member since it's a member route. Then let's define the form. Inside the show action is where we want to define the form, but I also want to show you that we have a span here called decomp, and this is where it shows the decomposition phase. This is the span we want to update with Ajax. Let's go ahead and create the form. We're going to wrap the form in a div called custom phase. We call form4. We need a custom URL here. We want to go to our custom decomp zombie path. We need to add remote true to make it an AJAX form. We're going to give it a custom phase title, a text field, a submit button, and that's pretty much it. So we have the custom route, we've defined the form. Next up, we need to create the action in our controller. Let's jump into our controller. So here's the custom decomp action. In here, we're going to find the zombie. We're going to set the decomposition status, and then we're going to save the zombie. And we don't need a respond to. We're only responding to JavaScript. That's all. So we don't need a respond to block. Now let's write the JavaScript to send back to the client. First, we're going to set that decomposition span to the new value of our decomposition. Let's go ahead and highlight that so it sticks out, calls our attention. Then, if the zombie decomposition is dead again, go ahead and fade out that form we just created. Let's check this out in action. So here we're going to set a custom phase. You can see when we add that, it highlights it and updates it. And now when we put dead again, it makes the form disappear. Now it's time for our final challenge. And we're basically going to do the same thing we did in our previous challenge, except this time we're only going to communicate with our server using JSON, and then we're going to write some client-side JavaScript to communicate with our server using JSON. So it's kind of like we're creating an API on the server and then writing JavaScript to communicate with that API. To make this happen, we're going to define the form. It's going to be a new form. We're going to modify the custom decomp action so that it responds to JSON. And then we're going to write the client-side JavaScript, and we're going to use CoffeeScript to do so. First up, let's define the new form. We specify form4 zombie, custom URL just like before, except here we're not putting in remote true. We give it a title, text field, and the submit button. Now let's modify the advanced decomp action. In here, we're going to have a respond to block and tell it that it responds to JavaScript and now JSON. If it wants JSON, we're going to render out just the decomp field. Lastly, we're going to write some client-side CoffeeScript. So here we are inside of our zombies.js.coffee. We've got document ready. Grab that form. When somebody submits the form, prevent the form from submitting. Grab the form URL, because we're going to want to use that later. Grab the custom decomposition value from that input field. Then we're going to do an AJAX call. The type is going to be put. Remember, it's a put action. We're going to call the URL from the form. We're going to send in some JSON. This is just plain old JSON right here. We specify the data type. And then if this request is successful, we're going to set the new decomposition, give it a highlight, then fade out the custom phase form if JSON decomp equals dead again. Let's take a look at this form in action. So I can set the custom phase as smelly, as putrid, or even as dead again. And if I set it as dead again and I hit set, it makes the form disappear. So you've reached the end of the videos, but your adventure isn't over yet. You've got some pretty sophisticated challenges to get through, and then once you get through those, don't forget you've got that outro video where we'll tell you where to go to learn more about each of these topics.